If I stripped away your gear, no jacket, no lighter, no knife, how long would you last? Hours? A day? For Native American frontiersmen, survival came down to 7 tools most of us wouldn't even recognize, and without them, you wouldn't stand a chance. For these frontiersmen, these weren't just tools, they were the lifeline between life and death. Could they still save you today? Stick around to the end to see that one tool you definitely still use today. Without these tools, survival wasn't just unlikely, it was impossible. Every spark, every stitch, every sharpened edge meant the difference between seeing tomorrow or becoming a memory buried in the wilderness. These weren't luxuries, they were essentials. And the deeper you understand them, the more you realize how fragile our modern safety net really is. The wilderness of early America was not a place that forgave weakness. On the plains, blizzards swept in like white walls, burying trails in freezing water before a man could blink. In the deserts, the sun scorched so fiercely that even the shadows seemed to wither. And in the forests, predators, both animal and human, waited for the one misstep that could end everything. For the frontiersman, survival wasn't a matter of luck. It was the careful art of avoiding mistakes. Because out here, a single one could carve a scar into your body or take your life altogether. Yet amid these brutal conditions, ingenuity shone. 7 tools emerged as the backbone of survival, crafted not in workshops but by hand. Wood, stone, bone, and hide, shaped by fire and necessity. Each tool was simple enough to overlook, yet essential enough that without it, even the strongest hunter would quickly fall. They were practical, reliable, and often doubled in use. The kind of tools that worked quietly, but never failed. If modern gadgets are fragile conveniences, these 7 were the sturdy old friends of survival. Dependable, clever, and in their own way, timeless. No survival without food, and no food without the bow. It is almost impossible to overstate how central this simple tool was to life on the frontier. For Native American frontiersmen, the bow and arrow weren't luxuries or even mere weapons. They were silent companions, as familiar as one's own hands. A well-crafted bow could decide whether a family ate meat through the long months of winter or starved when the snow sealed off the land. With it, hunters brought down elk heavy with fat, bison that provided not just food, but hides for shelter, and even fish along the riverbanks, skewered with accuracy that feels almost unbelievable today. And these weren't crude sticks tied together. Crafting a bow required patience, skill, and a keen understanding of the wood's grain and flexibility. The arrow, too, was a marvel of design. Obsidian tips, chipped to razor edges, cut through flesh as cleanly as modern steel. Every arrow carried a future, not just a meal, but clothing, tools, and even trade value. Miss your shot, and tomorrow suddenly looked uncertain. Hit your mark, and tomorrow was secured. It's worth remembering that these hunts demanded silence, timing, and nerve. You couldn't just spray and pray like with modern rifles. One arrow often meant one chance. That sense of pressure sharpened both skill and respect for the game. And while the bow gave the hunter a meal, the fire waiting back at camp turned that raw catch into safe nourishment. Without fire, even the best shot was wasted. So the bow and arrow were more than tools. They were lifelines, every bit as vital as the air a man breathed. And together with fire, they formed the first unbreakable partnership of survival. The fire drill was, without exaggeration, the frontiersman's most treasured tool. Not because it looked impressive. It was nothing more than a spindle, a hearthboard, and a length of cord. But because in its whirring, smoking motion, life itself was hidden. With steady hands and stubborn patience, a hunter could coax a thin ribbon of smoke into being. He would lean close, heart racing, and watch as the first glowing ember appeared, fragile as a newborn. A quick transfer into a nest of tinder, a careful breath, and suddenly the darkness gave way to flame. That flame meant far more than light. It turned raw meat into safe food, dirty river water into something drinkable, and long, frigid nights into bearable ones. Predators, too, thought twice about coming near when fire licked the air. It was warmth, security, and survival, bundled into one. To lose a fire starting kit in winter was not a small inconvenience. It was a direct invitation to death's doorstep. To master the fire drill, however, was to own the night. The crackle of burning wood became both shield and comfort, a reminder that man had bent nature's harshest element to his will. Of course, it was not an easy skill. Many tried and failed, rubbing sticks furiously until their hands blistered. But those who mastered it held a power that modern people, with their disposable lighters, rarely appreciate. Fire was not a button you pressed. It was an achievement. Still, flame alone could not do everything. To cut, carve, and prepare, another tool was always at hand, one as sharp and unforgiving as the wilderness itself, and it too would prove indispensable. The Obsidian Blade, sharper than steel. Obsidian, a volcanic glass, dark and gleaming, carved into an edge so fine it could split a hair. To the frontiersman, it was more than just a cutting tool. It was a companion in nearly every task. With an obsidian blade in hand, hides could be skinned clean, meat carved with precision, and wood shaped into bows, arrows, or tent pegs. It was the tool that turned raw materials into the essentials of daily life. And let's not forget its bite. Obsidian edges are sharper than most steel knives, even today. So sharp that modern surgeons sometimes use them in delicate operations. Imagine that, a piece of volcanic glass, crafted centuries ago by hands with no steel or factories, still outperforming some of our best modern instruments. That's not just ingenuity, that's timeless engineering. But the blade wasn't only for crafting and cooking. It was also defense. A small knife at a belt, or a larger edge in hand, meant a chance against an ambush or wild predator. The frontiersman trusted his blade the way a sailor trusts his compass. Without it, he was lost. Of course, these weren't disposable tools. An obsidian blade could shatter if mishandled, so it had to be carried with care, wrapped in hide or tucked into a sheath. To break your knife wasn't just clumsy, it was dangerous, stripping you of the tool that carved out both food and safety. So, in every sense, the blade was life condensed into an edge. Fragile in form, deadly in function, and irreplaceable in practice. But survival wasn't only about cutting. The body needed more than edges and sparks. It needed a way to carry life itself. And that came in the simplest vessel of all. Water was the silent killer of the frontier. Food you could go without for days, but water? 3 days without it, and even the strongest warrior would collapse. In the dry stretches of plains or deserts, thirst came faster than hunger, creeping in with cracked lips, pounding headaches, and the slow, dizzying fade of strength. Survival meant not only finding water, but carrying it, because the next stream or spring was never guaranteed. This is where ingenuity stepped in. Hollowed gourds became natural canteens, lightweight and surprisingly sturdy. Leather pouches were stitched and sealed tight, flexible enough to sling over the shoulder. Woven baskets coated with pine pitch carried water without leaking, proof that necessity is the mother of invention. These vessels were more than containers, they were lifelines. A hunter could walk miles across barren land, knowing that inside his pouch sloshed the difference between life and death. And it wasn't just about quantity. Water had to be kept safe. Contaminated rivers could bring sickness just as swiftly as thirst could bring death. That's why fire and water worked together. Boiling streams in hide pots or stone vessels turned danger into safety. Every sip was survival, and every leak was a threat. Lose your gourd to a careless drop on the rocks, and suddenly the wilderness closed in tighter. It's no exaggeration to say that the man who carried water carried life itself. But survival was more than drinking. The body needed warmth, protection, and insulation against the bitter nights. And so, from water vessels, we turn to another humble but vital invention, the needle. Carved from bone that stitched survival into every seam. Carved from bone and threaded with sinew, the needle was one of the quiet heroes of survival, an unassuming tool that rarely drew admiration but carried the weight of entire winters. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't intimidating. Yet without it, a man could be armed with the sharpest blade, the finest bow, and the keenest eyes, and still freeze to death before spring. The needle's magic lay in transformation. Animal hides, once stripped and scraped, became cloaks that turned away snow and rain. They became moccasins that padded across icy ground without splitting open. They became teepees that could be rolled up, carried, and rebuilt wherever the tribe settled next. Each stitch was a thread of security, sealing warmth into the body and shutting the cold out. In the wilderness, clothing wasn't a matter of style, but of survival. A tear in your leggings could mean frostbite. A loose seam in your shelter could let in the biting wind. And so, the humble bone needle was guarded with care, often tucked safely away, because losing one in the heart of winter was no less dangerous than losing a blade. It also required skill. A needle had to be carved fine enough to pierce hide, but sturdy enough not to snap. Sinew drawn from animal tendon had to be prepared, dried, and twisted. Every garment was the result of patience, a long, painstaking process that stitched life together, one seam at a time. And here's where a little humor fits. When a moccasin split in the dead of winter, nobody asked, "Who's the best hunter?" They asked, "Where's the one with the needle?" Because no matter how brave or strong, bare feet in snow made a man look foolish. and cold. Yes, the needle was humble, but it was also indispensable. Still, all the stitched hides and warm shelters meant nothing without food, and to feed those winters, the hunt demanded more than bows and arrows. It required tools of patience and cunning, snares and traps that worked even while the hunter slept. Not every day ended with a triumphant hunter returning with bison meat slung over his shoulders. Some days, the great herds were nowhere to be found. The arrows flew wide, or the weather itself kept hunters pinned in camp. On those days, survival leaned less on muscle and more on patience, the quiet work of snares and fishing weirs. Fishing weirs were clever constructions. Built from stones or wooden stakes, that guided schools of fish into narrow channels where escape was nearly impossible. A frontiersman could set one in a river and return later to find dinner waiting, as if the stream itself had decided to lend a hand. No dramatic chase, no wasted arrows, just a calm net of certainty woven into the water. On land, snares did the same. Fashioned from sinew, rawhide, or twisted plant fibers, they were loops of opportunity tightening around a rabbit or squirrel while the hunter focused on larger game. A good snare worked silently through the night, requiring no watchful eye. In a world where energy was precious, these tools multiplied a man's effort, giving him more hands than he actually had. There was wisdom in this kind of delegation. A bow and arrow demanded skill in the moment. A snare demanded skill beforehand, then patience. One tool required quick reflexes, the other, quiet faith. Together, they balanced the harsh equation of survival. Of course, there was always the risk of checking your trapline and finding nothing but empty loops or a clever rabbit's footprints leading away. Nature, after all, was not in the business of charity. Still, a set of well-placed snares often meant the difference between going to bed hungry or warming your hands around a pot of stew. But even with food secured, survival wasn't guaranteed, because no tool mattered if you couldn't find your way back to camp. In the endless stretches of plains, forests, and deserts, navigation itself became the most important tool of all. The final tool of survival wasn't carved from bone or shaped from stone. It wasn't tucked into a pouch or sharpened against a rock. It was carried in the mind, knowledge. For the frontiersman, navigation was not a matter of gadgets or compasses, but of reading the land itself as if it were an open book. The stars were the first guides. Hunters and travelers lifted their eyes at night and saw not just beauty, but direction. Constellations became maps written across the heavens, constant and dependable. By day, rivers and streams served as natural highways, their currents pointing the way toward fertile hunting grounds or distant camps. Mountain ridges, valleys, and the bend of a tree were not random features. They were signposts, as useful as any carved trail marker. To walk blindly into the wilderness without this mental map was courting disaster. A single wrong turn could stretch into days of wandering. Food supplies dwindled, thirst set in, and what began as a mistake ended in tragedy. Stories of men lost just a few miles from camp remind us how unforgiving the land could be. But those who mastered this invisible tool thrived. They built memory maps, landscapes etched into the mind, recalled with remarkable clarity even after years had passed. A certain bend in a river, a cluster of pines leaning east, a peculiar rock shaped like a buffalo. These became reference points as precise as any signpost. And here's a touch of humor. Today, many of us get lost walking out of a shopping mall parking lot. The frontiersman, on the other hand, could cross hundreds of miles, guided by nothing more than starlight and a sharp memory. In truth, knowledge was the greatest survival tool of them all. Knives could break, fires could die, water gourds could split, but the compass of the mind, once trained, never left a man's side. It left no trace in the hand, yet it meant everything in the wilderness. Here's the twist. Those 7 tools of survival are not relics gathering dust in museums. They are still with us, disguised perhaps, but alive in practice. Modern bushcrafters, men and women who test themselves against the wild, still kneel in the woods with bow drills, coaxing embers into flame, just as their ancestors once did. There are easier ways, of course, lighters, matches, even fire-starting gels, but nothing builds confidence quite like creating fire from nothing but wood and patience. The humble bone needle also hasn't lost its relevance. In survival schools, students are still taught to improvise sewing tools from bone, antler, or even sharpened wood. Why? Because stitching clothing or repairing gear in the field can mean the difference between comfort and calamity. A torn jacket may not sound deadly in your living room, but in a snowstorm, it's a different story entirely. Preppers and outdoorsmen today also practice mental mapping, training themselves to read the land and sky when batteries fail. And soldiers, with all the satellites, drones, and electronics at their disposal, are still taught to navigate by stars. Why? Because technology has a bad habit of failing exactly when it's needed most. What the frontiersmen carried wasn't primitive gear. It was timeless wisdom forged into tools. Tools so well designed, they still earn a place in modern survival kits. That's the real lesson. Innovation doesn't always mean newer. Sometimes the best answers are the ones carved from wood, stitched with sinew, or sparked from stone centuries ago. And that's not nostalgia. That's proof of what truly works. 7 tools, no supermarkets, no technology, no steel factories, and yet entire nations thrived. The takeaway is simple. Strip away modern gear, and you'd still need these same tools to survive. So I'll ask you, if you were dropped into the wild tonight, which tool would you reach for first? And which one surprised you the most? Drop your answer in the comments, because in the wilderness, curiosity might just be the first step to survival.